Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad to introduce you to Mark Pittman. He is doing the last webinar in this series that we're doing for the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference. Shannon and I are the co-producers of the conference, and we've been doing some webinars for folks that came to the conference last year and have had such a great time doing that. We thought we'd do this little series for folks who haven't gone to the conference and hopefully want to come to the conference. Okay, so this is Mark Pittman. He and I have been friends for, oh my gosh, years and years and years. And we've done so many things together. I'm amazed that this is the first time we're actually doing a webinar together.
I know.
Isn't that bizarre? It's just so
is.
bizarre. Mark is also the MC at the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference. And if you haven't gone to the conference, it is something completely different from any other conference you've been to. What conference has an MC that goes all the way through the whole conference with you? He just brings everything that you're learning from the different presenters together. And we have a ton of presenters at this year's conference. But we could talk about that a little bit later on at the very end of the webinar. So let's keep moving.
That's me next.
Oh, that's it? Oh, so Mark, take it away. So glad you're here.
I would be glad to. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I am thrilled to share with you some scary stuff and then hopefully ease that fear as we go through. This slide right here shows the number of 501c3s according to the National Center for Charitable Statistics, urban.org. The most recent data that I could still find only ends in 2012. But look at the numbers here. You've got about 1.5 million in 1995 501c3s in the United States. And I know that we have an international audience. I'm not trying to exclude you, but this is the data that I was able to get. By the 2012, there was over 1.6 million. So 1,500,000. No, that would be 1.5 million. So it's like 1 million here, and then 12 years later it was 1.6 million. That works out to be something like 566 new 501c3s. And for those of you not in the United States, 501c3s is just one category of nonprofit, and it doesn't include the charity jars, all the GoFundMe pages or the coin collections at the convenience store, any of that. But that's 566 new 501c3s each week for 12 years. This is only going to get, well, I was going to say worse, because as boomers are retiring, 10,000 are hitting retirement age every day. Many of them are looking for their second act, what's their meaning, purpose, raison d'etre going to be, what's their legacy. They're starting charities without looking to see what else is around. And we all want the same thing, don't we? We want people's attention. But have you noticed that our donors are feeling a lot more frustrated? They're getting bombarded with all sorts of messaging, not just ours. They're getting messaging from all sorts of companies too. And with the messages they get, have you noticed that donors seem to be getting more strategic? They want, rather than it used to be back in the day, back in the World War II generation, they just give a check and it would be happy, and they'd give it to the unrestricted giving. But increasingly, donors want to know what their money is going to, what the returns on the project are. How do we take all of this distraction and strategicness and changes in the society and get it so that our donors are actually undistracted, looking across the table from us, eager to hear what we're wanting to tell them? I would argue it's story. We've been telling stories forever. We used to sit around the campfire and just kind of talk about the one that got away. Even according to some statistics, tens of thousands of years ago, there were stories about the one that got away. Even before there was language, there were these pictograms of how to hunt and how to pass on knowledge from generation to generation. In fact, it's something that's so core to who we are as human beings that many say it's in our DNA. Jane Goodall, who studies chimpanzees or is known for that, says that humans are storytelling primates. There's a part of our brain structure that is created perfectly for language and story, and there may be only 2 other species on the planet that have it, dolphins being one of them. But for sure, what human beings are, it's just weird. We're really weird beings. Part of what we're getting to do now is thoroughly exciting because we're studying the neuroscience of story. We're getting to see that when you tell a story, and when you say, well, let me tell you a story, the parts of the brain that activate are the same ones that happen when you're moving, when you're exercising, not the ones that you think of when you're quantifying data and doing that sort of the more analytical things. It moves the brain from analysis over to action and emotion and experience, which is really helpful for all of our nonprofits. There's a wonderful book called Story Proof, The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story by Kendall Haven, that takes all of this. So if you're a wonk like me, it takes all of these studies. He went through study after study and reviews of studies. One chapter deals with 120 studies of narrative and story, and those 120 studies or reports deal with another 800 underneath it. So it's practically 1,000 different studies referenced in just one chapter alone. What's startling is every time after time, in science what we're used to is somebody posing a hypothesis and then somebody else coming against it and critiquing it. And it happens with story that even the people that aren't trying to study story, they're trying to study memory, they're trying to study learning, they're trying to study something else, are finding out that narrative format is something that our human brains are predisposed to retaining information shared this way. We do not remember lists, we remember stories. Think about your last board meeting. How many people on your board would be able to recite your mission statement or the pie chart of your statistics, of your fiscal accountability for the year? Very few, if any. But they might remember the story, especially the story of how they got to the nonprofit, and maybe a story that you shared about some of the impact that you're doing. Well, as we're studying some of the brain science, one of the things that Kendall reported about was that stories even improved kids' math scores. Children that had studied story, how story format works, were able to perform better even on math tests. It's just totally blows my mind that it would be that way. But remember back in the day when it was really easy to get people's attention? There were 3 channels, there was PBS, and we were able to just basically, the military industrial complex sort of thing of, if we wanted to get people's attention, we just had to buy more time on TV. If we had a big enough spending budget, we could get enough people to respond to whatever we were offering them or trying to get them to do. It's not that way anymore, is it? Look at all these fragments. People's attentions are fragmented. People's thoughts are all over the place. But what I love about this, so some people see this type of image with all these different screens and think fear or distraction or time suck. I don't even know how I'm going to try to talk to everybody. But what I love about it is, let's just say, look at these people up here and this one next to the YouTube. What if that's like a storytelling conference going on right there, and the rest of these people are other things, and your nonprofit happens to do a story? That is where you want to be. And so now, for the first time in human history, we get to be that localized around the globe. We get to find people with our passions around the globe that are doing the same thing. So that, to me, is totally exciting. And when you have all these screens, all this distraction, seriously, the way to break through is with a story. So let me tell you a story. So I'm going to tell you a story, and if we were live right then, I would have paused when I said, let me tell you a story. I would have let it sink in if we were in the room together. Because, Joel, just think back when you're at a lecture and somebody said, there's droning on, kind of like the Peanuts teacher, wah, 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 wah. Then they say, let me tell you a story. The atmosphere totally changes. And part of that could be the receptors in our brain that are triggering and shifting emphasis so that they can listen to the story. This story here tells you all about, incorporates all the great aspects of a story, the classic aspects of a story, which is what I'm going to tell you the story, unpack the classic kind of formula, how to put a story together, and then we're going to look at the 5 stories your nonprofit needs to be telling, given that background. Why I love this story is it's from Andy Goodman, who was a master storyteller himself. I don't think he'd ever call himself that, but he worked in Hollywood, and he told the story, and I just haven't been able to come up with a better one to illustrate this. So picture yourself in a grocery store. His friend Bob was in a grocery store. Bob is a blogger for parents, and so whenever he's out in public, he's looking for examples of people and parenting and things that he can blog about. So when he went to the grocery store, he went to the deli counter, and have you ever noticed that when you pull that tag on the deli counter, you look at the number, and then you look up at the number of that they're serving? It seems like there's alternate universes. You're looking at number like 104, and they're only serving number 30. That happened to Bob. So he's knowing he had some time to kill. He just kind of was waiting, biding his time to get his cold cuts. And in through the door comes this woman and a child in a cart, and the kid is screaming her head off, Rah! And the mom is saying it just seems remarkably calm, which automatically gets Bob's radar up. It's going to be okay, Jennifer. We just need to get the milk, the peanut butter, and the bread. We're going to be fine. And so now Bob is still stuck at this deli counter, and just as it getting closer to his number, she goes around, and so he can't get her. He has to get his cold cuts. Have you ever, he still hears the screaming kid, and he hears, it's going to be okay, Jennifer. We just get the bread. We just need to get the milk and the peanut butter. We're going to be fine. Ah! Have you ever tried to find anybody in a grocery store? It seems like it should be so easy because it's aisles. Straight aisles. You could just walk down the aisles, and he did that. He walked down the aisles, and he heard them somewhere else in the story, over the top. So you hear this, Rah! It's going to be okay, Jennifer. We got the bread and the milk. We just need to get the peanut butter. Everything's going to be fine. And he's so intrigued by how this woman's just keeping such a calm demeanor in the face of all this adversity. So then he started walking down the back of it because he was thinking maybe that would be where he could find this woman. And then he realized there was one place that all ethical people go in the supermarket. It's the checkout. So he goes to the checkout, and sure enough, it's going to be okay, Jennifer. We got the bread, we got the milk, we got the peanut butter. We're going to be fine. And so the mom and child go into one of these lanes. He pulls in behind him, feeling somewhat predatory. And while they're waiting to check out, he says, excuse me, I'm sorry, this is weird, but my name is Bob. I write a parenting blog, and I'm just amazed at how this. Just to have some questions for you about your parenting because you're doing such a great job. And the woman's kind of flustered, not really in her space, and she said, "So, yeah, I guess go ahead, ask your questions." And so Bob said, "Well, first of all, how old is little Jennifer here?" And the woman looks at him with this puzzled look and says, "What?" And he repeats himself. He says, "Well, how old is Jennifer here?" And she looked at him again and said, "I'm Jennifer." Now, if we were in a room, usually this is a time release thing with people getting the joke. And many of you are probably laughing right now. What's really fun about this is that Jennifer, it's going to be all right, Jennifer. We just need to get the bread, the peanut butter, the milk. Well, she was talking to herself the whole time, not to her kid. What I love about this story is it shows all the characteristics of story structure that Aristotle kind of put out thousands of years ago. First of all, it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. In this story, what was the beginning? Bob going into the grocery store and trying to get some cold cuts. Then the middle was where he was trying to find Jennifer, and at the end was the I'm Jennifer, where a lot of us kind of mess up in nonprofit storytelling is that we try to get everybody to understand. I've had so many people. I just emailed a group of a subset of my blog readers and said, what are the biggest challenges facing you in the next 12 months? And so many of them are coming back to me saying, we just need more people to fully understand exactly everything that we do. What they're trying to do is get them to start at the beginning. And what we know from good storytelling is that most people start in medias res, right in the middle of things. My son's getting into Lost, airplane crashes, and then they keep unpacking every episode backstories of people. If they tried to take 26 or 30 people and tell their backstories and then build up to the crash, they would have bored everybody to tears and confused everybody because they wouldn't have understood it. They started at a common crisis point for people, and then they told the backstory. And this is a link here, nonprofitstorytellingconference.com/story-jam-mark with a C-Pittman with one T. Shannon Greer and I were able to just kind of have a conversation. She pulled it together about the importance of starting in the middle of the story. You don't need to start at the beginning all the time. And then Aristotle said every story has a hero. There's somebody that they can identify with. And when I'm doing this in a live room training, I'll ask who's the hero, and most people will say Jennifer, because any of us that have been a parent know that sometimes our kids just don't behave the way we want them to, and it's not necessarily a reflection on our parenting as much as we think it is on other people's parenting when we're at Walmart and we see the kids. But in this one, the hero of the story is Bob. Bob is the eyes that we see the story through. We're monitoring his behavior, his actions, and so that's where this is. And this is kind of important in nonprofits because often our nonprofit heroes are the nonprofit organization themselves. That's what we try to put in there. And when I was listening to this part, some of the training that I early on had was with Andy Goodman. After the story, I said, "Can the nonprofit be the hero?" And he was respectful in answering, but he said, humans really kind of interact with other people better. They connect with people better than they do with organizations. So you really should consider making the hero a person. And in the case that at that point I was working at a hospital, I was talking about how the hospital was created in the 1940s in response to the health needs in the community. It was a really, I thought, moving story. When I dug a little deeper, I found out that it was 6 physicians who got together, 3 male physicians, 3 female physicians, and they all gave money, about the equivalent of about today's dollars of $6,000 each, to start a hospital. So all of a sudden it moved from our hospital is doing great things to we have been surrounded by people that are committed to this community. And I could tell any of you that have been in healthcare philanthropy, the doctors aren't as generous with their cash as we'd expect or in hope. So it was kind of fun to be able to have a story with heroes in it that were of their peers. Hey, you didn't know this when you're joining the medical staff, but we have a long history of attracting really generous people, both in their time and in their money. Now, Aristotle goes on and says, just if you have a beginning, middle, and end in a hero, that's not a story yet. He said you need to have conflict. And the way that that's often talked about is hero plus an obstacle equals conflict. So think about this book right here, Goodnight Moon. There's no conflict there, right? It's boring. The 6th or 8th time you have to read it as a parent, it's just sort of like, can you just read it to yourself, kid? But the point of the book is no conflict. It's all about trying to, if those of you don't know it, what I remember of it is it's a kid that's trying to not go to sleep, and so says goodnight to everything in its room. Goodnight mouse, goodnight teacup, goodnight saucer. And the whole thing is just trying to ease someone into sleep as opposed to getting them engaged and having their adrenal glands going. Think about Finding Nemo instead. That has some conflict in it. That has, starting out with a conflict of why is Nemo's fin funny? And telling that story, and then Nemo going into the boat, and his father going after them, and it's just kind of obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And if you look at the deleted scenes from Finding Nemo, you'll see that they had another whole sequence when Nemo left the dentist office. There was supposed to be a whole wastewater treatment sequence that was very much like the sequence that they had, and they realized this is just redundant to the same thing. But they're trying to throw more obstacles at them, and that keeps us engaged. That keeps us wanting to be interested in the story and finding out how this is going to happen. If you've ever seen any of the Mission Impossibles, but particularly Ghost Protocol, that is just conflict on steroids. I've heard 24 is this too, but with this one, it starts out with all of a sudden you start out right in the middle of things. Tom Cruise is in the Kremlin in Russia in a prison. Turns out it's in the Kremlin. He's part of a prison break, and then the entire Kremlin blows up, and it's blamed on him. And it's just, horrendous obstacle after horrendous obstacle as they're going through with this team. And then there's a happy resolution at the end. But it just has you on the edge of your seat with all the conflict. We tend to shy away from this in nonprofits. We tend to not really like conflict. We want harmony. Many of us want peace. We want everybody to understand what we're doing, and we just need to give up on some of that. Because not everybody's going to get what we're doing, and our stories can help define and help us focus on the people that are. Kind of like all those screens with instead of trying to be the one screen for everybody, we can focus on the people that are predisposed to hearing what we're interested in, that value what we're doing. Finally, the storyteller needs to work to help the listener be immersed in the story. So think about some of the things that I did to make you engaged in the story. We talked about the deli counter. Talked about, have you ever tried to be in an aisle? And usually when I'm acting this out in front of an audience, I'll also have people in the aisle that seem to get in the way, and there's that sort of just kind of dodge them that I'll put in there. Talked about being in the back, so asking questions. When I talk about the deli, I also often will pull as though I'm pulling the deli ticket, doing that motion with my hand. I talked about the ethical people going to the checkout. A lot of questions and a lot of trying to relate and hook people into this is Bob's experience. And then the humor at the end. was trying to get you to also relate to the whole story. So you're engaged in more than just having something monologued at you. The way that Andy summed this up was he called it storytelling for dunces. Act one, get a hero up a tree. Act two, throw rocks at him. And Act three, get him down. If you just had Act one and Act three, it would be kind of a boring story. What's interesting to me is even the Harvard Business Review had a blog post that telling stories, better stories, actually increases prices. So we think about if you think about fundraising, the story webinar, we're going to go into the 5 stories, and you'll see that they're not all about fundraising. But if you wanted to raise more money, you could see on the right there the link to this whole study. They took 2 of the same toasters from junk shops. One they just listed as a toaster, the other they listed as some sort of story behind it, and the one with some sort of story sold for exponentially more than the few cents that the other one sold for. So it's kind of interesting how stories actually improve the value of things and improve what we're doing. It helps people relate to them differently. So let's look at the 5 buckets of stories, and these are what was promised in the top of the webinar, the 5 stories your nonprofit needs to be telling. I'm going to you'll see how these will fit in, knowing what you know about the formula for telling stories. Just remember that as you're thinking through your nonprofits. I'd really encourage you, if you haven't yet, take out a sketch pad and just write these 5 down as I go through each bucket and explain what they mean, because these are resources. These are your organizational identity. These are things that you're going to be telling externally to donors and volunteers and people you serve, or you're going to be telling internally to kind of rally the troops and get through tough times. These are also where you're going to find your nonprofit's voice. So much of social media and other communications that we do can be so hard because we try to do corporate voice. We try to do voice by committee, and we have a bunch of people review our letters and hash it up and make them bad. This will help you start figuring out what kind of quirky voice aspects, and it doesn't have to be huge quirky, just personable, but what's the style of your nonprofit? So without further ado, let me go through the 5 buckets. The first one is your founding story, and these are from I think it was Robert Reich. I was looking for the book. It's on my bookshelf, but I couldn't find it before this seminar. He talks about 5 stories in American history in a book he did in the 80s. I have also, so founding story is one name for it. I also would call this your Genesis story. And I do that because I've related each of these 5 to Hebrew and Christian scriptures only because I want to show that this isn't just a United States thing. This isn't just a North America thing. And it's not just a 21st century thing. These 5 stories resonate with human beings. Different cultures, different times. There seems to be something really deep in our human experience that each of these 5 types of stories embody. So, the founding story. These are the stories of why your nonprofit was needed. What got it started? What wrong was there that the people that created your nonprofit wanted to right? What was wrong with the world? This is so important because, as Tom Ahern, who's one of our presenters, says, what we're doing in nonprofit work with donors is we're inviting donors into a fight. Donors want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to be part of a battle, and we're getting to engage them into a fight. So what's the fight that they're getting to engage in? Think about that. And usually that's with our founding story. Now, when I do this, there's often a question about, well, wait a minute, you don't know our founder. They kind of want to get, founder syndrome. Our founder is the poster child for that. And that's totally legit. So with your founding story, it'll be founding for your organization. And if you can't be associated with your founder anymore, think about the values. What were the values? And was it compassion that caused them to move? Was it a sense of justice? Was it just nobody else is doing something, somebody has to do this? What was it? And then start telling it in that way. That's one way to do it. The other thing with founding stories is to think about the founding of different aspects, different projects, different phases of your life, of your organizational life. It could have a new head, a new executive director, and it could be part of kind of reevaluating yourself if you're doing a new strategic plan. So there are many different options for founding stories, but you need to know what they are, and particularly your first one. And we all have them. the beauty of these is that, and I didn't mean this is a freebie. I didn't even think about this with the slide, but the beauty of it is that all of our nonprofits are started because people gave. They gave time, they gave talent, they gave interest, they gave money. So we all have philanthropic histories that we could tell. So that's one of the reasons I love it. And you can ask me in the questions after. That would be fine. I'd love to build on that some. So you have your founding story. What was your genesis story? The next one, this is one that we nonprofits find really, really hard to talk about, is your mess up stories. I call these your Balaam stories. For those of you who know, apologies up front for anybody that's going to be offended by my using the word ass, but any of you who know Balaam and Numbers in the Hebrew Scriptures, he was a prophet that was hired by a tribe to curse all these slaves that were wandering around and creating this huge imbalance of power in the Dead Sea area, or yeah, in the promise, what became the Promised Land. And he said, I can't go, and the king kept sending more emissaries and giving more money, and so he finally said, well, I can go, but I can't curse. And on his way, and he had been told by God not to go, on his way, his donkey finally stops because there's an angel with a flaming sword, and it blocked him, tried to block him a few times, and finally gets a part where it blocks him. The donkey stops, and he kicks his donkey. Why are you stopping? You got to keep going. And the donkey turns around and talks to him. It says, am I in the habit of not doing this? Can you not see that there's an angel here? So as a pastor, when I pastored a church for 4 years, I'd say that's just proof that God can use any ass to get out his message. That's sort of what we're looking at for mess up stories. What you want to do is, what are you selling? Where did you just risk something and totally fall flat on your face? It could be like this. This was a real letter that I got from the hospital after I left the hospital in 2010. I got this mailing. I have an endowment there. I did have an endowment payment due. Maybe they were eager to get that endowment payment, but this is all I got, was an envelope with my name on it, and then a business reply remittance envelope. Nothing else. That wouldn't be necessarily the type of founding story that you'd want to, the type of mess up story you want to talk about. What you're looking for is, what are the values you want your staff members and your proponents, your supporters, what are the values that you want to champion? So like having a CFO that embezzles funds is not a mess up story that's going to help you in getting your word out. But maybe it's something like at that hospital in the HR department, they had a major organizational priority for customer service. They wanted to have excellent customer service for their staff. And they knew that was one of the things that they were measuring. So every week they had this, they would pass around a trophy, and it wasn't as pretty as this. It was a trophy that was like from Spencer Gift with the guy mooning, and they called it the Dumbass Award, where they would, where did you make the biggest mistake in trying to provide customer service? Where did you go out on a limb on behalf of one of our staff members and totally mess up or get suckered? And what was great about that was not only did they didn't put it on desks, it wasn't an organizational thing, it was just in this department, but everybody from the VP who was on the senior staff of the hospital down to the first person answering the phones was vying for this trophy. Can you imagine how freeing that was for everybody? Think about the VP. When a new employee comes in and you see your boss's boss telling about the stupid mistakes he made and for the right reasons, doesn't that, first of all, risk taking, and if you're not taking risks nowadays, you're gonna fail. We need to be continuing to take risks for the right reasons. But also, if there's a mess up, no one's going to be hiding it under the rug, because it's much easier to go into your boss or your boss's boss or however many levels you have and say, all right, I know it's not our staff meeting yet. I think I might have just single-handedly won the award and we might need to fix it right now. So you have this open communication because you're freely talking about messing up for the right reason. So that's your mess up stories.
Mark,
yeah, go ahead.
I just have one quick little story about a mess up story.
Awesome.
The power of the mess up story, I should say. And that is, I was talking with a major donor to an organization this one time, and she hadn't always been a major donor. She was actually a volunteer at the organization. So she got to see all of the mess up stories. She got to see the problems that they were having.
Oh.
When she came into some money and gave, a large donation, they started treating her differently, and they swept all
Oh,
of that stuff under the table. So she never got to see the troubles that they were having, the roadblocks that they got into. She was only being told the stories of all the great successes at that point, and she felt like an outsider at that point, because if you don't
interesting.
tell a mess up story, there's nothing for the person, the donor, who wants to be engaged with you. There's nothing for them to sink their teeth into. They don't feel truly a part of the team. And so she really missed being part of a team because she no longer got those mess up stories. So
That's
I
really
just want to,
interesting. So there's a level of trust. It's sort of like your inner circle where you're part of the family. Let's share.
exactly,
Remember Crazy Uncle Harry? We just had a Crazy Uncle Harry moment. Let's tell you about it. That's really cool.
right. Okay, keep
That's
going.
excellent. Well, that reminds me too of Jeff Brooks's new book, Turning Words into Money. He talks about how in a true fundraising letter, you can't have a happy ending to the story, because if there's a happy ending to the story, the donor is not needed. And for fundraising letters, you want the donor to be the hero, and the only way they can be a hero is if they can have a tangible way of fixing the problem. So that's interesting. I'm not saying that you should use a mess up story, but an incomplete story can be good. And it's interesting how that donor didn't. She felt like an outsider all of a sudden when she was getting the whitewash stuff.
Yep.
Oh, that just breaks my heart for her. Wow. Suffering stories are the third type of story that we see through human history. These are stories. The way I like to talk about these stories, I call them Jeremiah stories. In Hebrew Scriptures, Jeremiah it's kind of a long book of just, well, Lamentations is another book that was written by him, but it's just a long book of suffering. And these are the stories that remind us that it's good to keep going. The perfect example that I've experienced with this was, I'm talking a lot about the hospital today. It's so funny, Chris, when I do different teachings to see which nonprofits help, kind of pop up, or which experiences. Well, today seems to be the hospital in Waterville experiences. But when I was there, the housing market fell through. We had just finished a capital campaign. Pledges were being paid, but hadn't fully been paid off. We were in the senior staff meeting and having to talk about layoffs, or RIFs, they call them, reduction in force. And all of the middle and senior managers were all in the same room, as we had one of these no secrets cultures, and there was like everybody's goals and objectives were put up on a projector. And we just had this really tough talk about where things are, the numbers are going in the wrong direction. There are increasing numbers of people that aren't able to pay the bills, so we're going to have to do some reduction in force. We're going to have to do this. We had just been assured by the CEO we're not going to look at the 2-ply versus 1-ply toilet paper. I've done that before. That's not a winning battle. We're going to look at other things first. And there was just kind of a pall that hit the room. And then one of the spunkier middle managers raised her hand and just said, "You guys know it's going to be okay, right?" And everybody looked at her. "What do you mean?" She said, "We've been here before. 1986 when the tax changes changed, at this time when the merger happened, at this time, we've been here before, and it's going to be tough, and we're going to have to make some uncomfortable decisions. But we're going to get through it. We're going to make it. We're going to keep going." And it was just, you could see this sort of sobering, yeah, this is going to be tough. There was no sugarcoating that, but it was the assurance and the confidence of, we're going to get it out. And going to the board the next day was so much easier, because you could tell the board the real deal. It's not going to be pretty. People may be being laid off. We need you to understand that we're doing the best that we can with what we've got, with the forces that are at us. But we're going to be here. The hospital's not existence isn't in danger. It's just not going to be. It's going to be a little messy for a while. So those are your suffering stories. Those can be very instilling when I have confidence. But when I was doing this in Salt Lake City a couple weeks ago, we took time between each of these stories to kind of make your own. And one of the common questions with people as I was roaming the room was, "You wouldn't tell these to donors, would you?" And generally, no. Not all these 5 stories are stories for fundraising. These can be internal stories, because as human organizations that are made up of human beings, we need to be telling ourselves stories too. And this is part of the narrative of You're part of something bigger than yourself. The organization's going to keep going. It's going to be okay, even though it's not going to be comfortable. We'll get through. So this is the ones that many of us feel much more excited to give, the phoenix stories. The bird that destroys in the ashes and then rises out of the ashes as a reborn bird. I call these the Nehemiah stories because in the book of Nehemiah in Hebrew scriptures, he hears, well, for any of you that are interested in I think it's the oldest autobiographical account of a fundraiser ever, Nehemiah 1 and 2. He asks the emperor and he asks for permission to go to the city, and then the emperor says, when will you be back? So he takes that as a yes, and he also asks for a line of credit. He doesn't just stop on the first ask. It's really cool. But he also says he was scared. So there's this, it's a fun story from a fundraising perspective. But then if you're looking at, let's see, so Nehemiah stories, okay, so he goes to Jerusalem. The walls are down, and he at one point he's being attacked by local tribal leaders, and so he has at one point his builders with one brick in one hand and a sword in the other. And that's what these phoenix stories are. It's where did you have to gut it out? Where did you have to fight with a brick in one hand and a sword in the other? And you're still building what you're called to build. You're still there to do what the founding story was, but you had tremendous opposition, and you overcame it. Two organizations that are brilliant at this, wherever you stand on what they do, two organizations that I've seen wield phoenix stories well, and they've finely tuned their supporters to these phoenix stories, are Planned Parenthood and NPR. So Planned Parenthood, Susan Buchanan decides to make a fairly small, it was $600,000, but in the scheme of the budget for both organizations, it was a small difference in the way they were going to do funding allocation and withdraw funding from Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood raises the battle cry, hey, it's happening again, we're being attacked again, and they end up raising millions of dollars in addition to getting the funding back, because they are good at doing this. Hey, we're still doing the good stuff, but even from the people that we thought we could trust, there's this opposition. The other one is NPR. Whenever somebody in Congress says, well, we shouldn't be funding public radio, which, the funding for public radio is mostly from individuals. I won't get into that. But when they say we shouldn't be funding this, then Ari Shapiro will get on saying that the importance of individuals giving to their local station and to NPR. And it's just they use these opposition things instead of hunkering back and trying to weather out a storm or build defenses. They go on the offense, and they're able to say, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to rally more people to our cause. Because, like Tom Ahern said, donors are really wanting to get into a fight that's bigger than themselves, and this is a way to let them do that. So those are your Phoenix stories, your Nehemiah stories. The last bucket is your glorious end stories. And these are, ironically, ones that we don't think much about. These I call the Revelation story, where the New Jerusalem's coming down from heaven and earth is transformed. For you, what is it like when you finish the race? What is your organization? What would the world be like when your organization is no longer needed? Think about that. What are the quality of life of people? And for many of our organizations, that doesn't exist. But for some, I like these because I think it helps avoid mission creep in some circumstances. If you've been funded to fight something and it's fixed, there's a lot of integrity in saying, we're done. And that's it. Thank you so much. You helped us do this. But for many of our organizations, as far as I know, throughout all human history, there's been poverty. And so fighting against poverty is noble and good and right and just. And there is a way of knowing, you can quantify what it would look like when people aren't living in poverty anymore. So you can still tell this story. Why this story is so important, even though it may not be achieved in our lifetime, is that it reminds us what it's all about. It reminds us while we're getting all the hard work of being on a board or working at our jobs, it reminds us that there's something bigger. It's like we're getting our heads picked up and we're looking at the horizon, remembering where we're going. When we're doing these, these are all 5 of the stories: founding stories, your mess up stories, your suffering stories, your phoenix stories, your glorious end stories. These are ways that you start having these buckets to pull from. So there's two ways that you'll start noticing yourselves thinking, if this is a format that fits for you, you'll be thinking about, oh, that should be in our founding story. Or, boy, I just messed up. I wonder if that would go in the mess up bucket. Or if you're looking at something that's kind of uncomfortable, maybe a few months that aren't really, they're a little lean, you'll be able to say, dip into your suffering stories and say, maybe I should take this one out and just share this with some people. The other thing that you're going to be seeing is as you're starting to share these with people, you're going to get more back. We are keepers of the lore in our organizations. Those of us who are fundraisers and marketers, we're talking externally. And when we start sharing these stories externally, people will tell us theirs. So just like Chris said, there'll be that donor that says, this is why I'm involved. Our job is to then take that story back to the staff and say, your work matters. Somebody's noticing. This is why they're involved. And it creates this virtuous loop of them then telling us more stories, and it keeps getting better. But worst thing that we could do in our organizations is think that we're in control of the story. We have our brand guidelines. You may not use our logo that way. You can't tweak it that way. You need to use it the way with our CMYK or RGB colors. This was Lafley was the CEO of Procter & Gamble. I think it was around 2006 when he was speaking in front of the Association of National Advertisers, saying, the more in control we think we are, the more out of touch we become. With all the different social media tools, and this is just a handful that are out there, people are talking, if not about our organization, they're talking about the stuff that we do, the fight that we're in. And we need to just try to loosen up the strings a little bit and trust people to run with the story. But with our telling the same stories, the same buckets, and harvesting them and being intentional, maybe starting board meetings with the stories and starting staff meetings with the stories, it'll be as though we're giving a script to people. So if they're going for an audition, instead of just handing our board member a script, that could be a little demeaning. Here, this is what you say the next time you're in the Rotary line, and the prime donor in our community walks up behind you and says, so I hear you're involved with this organization. Don't say this, instead of saying, well, I had to do community service, like you're on parole. And they wouldn't take that, and we wouldn't want that inflicted on ourselves either. But as we're consistent about harvesting our story and telling them well, people will just say, I don't really know about this, the mission. I can't remember the mission statement, but let me tell you what they just did to Susie last month. There's this really powerful story about Susie, or the animals they released into the wild. It was so moving to see them go back to their natural habitat. And those stories are even better sometimes than the statistics that we thought were really good. So there are more nonprofits every week, over 566 over a 12-year stretch, new nonprofits every week getting created. All of us needing to tell our stories more effectively. But the good news for those of us, the bad news for donors, the good news for those of us on the call is that very few nonprofits, even with all the headlines you hear about it, very few nonprofits are doing this effectively. But when they do, and what we've learned with the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference is that donors are eager to give, and they're eager to give their attention and their money. Many of our attendees, I keep hearing from them. I don't know statistically how many there are, but there are attendees that are doubling and tripling their money because they're learning to tell the stories well. They're just a wonderful, wonderful experience. I don't know if that's happened to you, Chris, but it's the first time in 20 years of my doing this that I've had people ask me, Mark, how do I reframe my board's expectations? Because we just doubled our donations, and they think we're going to do that again next year. It's a real privilege to be part of that.
Well, I love it. Well, yeah, we'll get to, questions and answers, but as far as hearing from past attendees, I've been hearing from past attendees saying, hey, I want to bring my whole board, or I want to bring my whole staff. It was so impactful to our organization. Can you imagine what it's going to be when everybody at my organization has the training? So people are coming back this year, bringing their staff, 2, 3, 4 people. So that's wonderful. Okay, so let's get to the questions.
From adult learning, I knew adult learning, it's always better to have 2 people so you can compare notes. But to see the power of just one person coming has been transformative for some and that's even with the board still fighting the whole idea of stories because they still think it's soft. It's not. It's touchy-feely. Well, no, it's actually really good. It's powerful. But anyway, yeah. So
But you know what I love about storytelling is it.
so anybody wait
Yeah.
for those of you listening, this is like Chris and me like for years now. We'll get riffing on stuff, and it's so much fun for us anyway. Hopefully it's fun for you too. But yeah,
Well,
what do you love about stories?
we don't have the time to go off on a riff. But what I love about storytelling is it reduces the stress of everybody because now
Everybody.
you have
Yeah.
your 5 different types of stories. If you have been working at that and kind of have your glasses on, looking at the communications that come in, look at the different stories that cross your desk or that you hear from staff, and you start putting the stories into the different buckets. Now, when you're presented with an opportunity, whether you're out in the community or whether you're talking with board members or whether your board members are out there, you can engage people with stories. You don't have that stress of, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? Because it's
Right.
not about promoting your nonprofit. It's really about sharing the values through a story because that's what engages people. And then once they're
It's
engaged,
not
you
about
can bring them in
memorizing a
closer.
script and oh no, I forgot the most important phrase that was no, it's not scripted.
It's so
Yeah.
much easier than what people are doing. Fundraising is a lot easier when you punch up storytelling to the top of what you're doing.
Well, so I just had a person storied, not scripted is what I'm writing down. Maybe I'll get that as a website. That's the other thing Chris and I do is we have a URL addiction. But there was a guy I was working with his fundraising letters, helping him get stories and making the donor the hero of the story. And I've blogged about this on the we's, circling the we's and the u's, and circling the we's hours and hour with red pen because those will put you in the red, and circling the yours and your with black pen because that's what's going to put your fundraising in the black. And he said, Mark, I got into nonprofits to serve, and fundraising always felt like I was taking. But now that I'm telling stories and I'm thinking intentionally about the donor and thinking about what's the difference that she can make in the life of this person whose story I'm talking about, I'm just serving her. It's the same. There's integrity now in my work. It's not like I have to put on and become a different person, a manipulator. I'm just serving. And you know what's even more amazing, Mark? I said, what? He said, it works. I'm getting more money from this. So yeah, it reduces stress and it increases effectiveness. Who isn't looking for that?
Exactly. Okay, so we have about 8 minutes left. Let's get to some of these questions. There's a box full of them. So, okay, can you tell us some mess up stories that have motivated donors that they could be shared externally? I could think of one type.
Go for it. Yeah, good.
And that was when the whole economic downturn happened. I heard some nonprofit boards or board members talk about how they lost money because they had invested. I can't think of the word that they call it, but they had invested money over in this area. So they had to go back to some of the major and tell them why they lost money and why their money didn't grow in this particular fund.
But it was a fund that they were on. It was a values choice reason. It wasn't because they were trying to do speculative stuff, or?
Right. I mean, it's a fund that would have worked under normal circumstances, but with the downturn, like everybody lost money there. So as a leader, it's sometimes very difficult to say, you know what, we messed up. So
absolutely.
So I can think of, that was the first one that jumped to my mind because I saw.
Well, since I happen to be on the hospital
organization
kind of thing, the hospital theme, one of the ways that we use stories in our hospital was to orient and onboard people, particularly staff. We had a much better staff orientation than we had a board orientation when I got there. But one of the stories they talked about was a nurse who saw a gentleman in the middle of the Maine winter come into the emergency room and have no jacket. It was very cold. As he was getting cared, being triaged, she went across town, because it was across town, and it was a town, to a store and got a jacket for him, and came back and just made sure that he had a jacket on her own time, on her own money. It wasn't a hospital funded thing, and the hospital heard about that and started telling that in the orientation, not to get nurses and staff to use their own money for this sort of thing. They ended up freeing up some funds for that. But they were saying, this is the type of people we attract. I don't know what your experience has been at other hospitals, but we attract people that are into not just the clinical excellence, but they're also into the people caring part of this. And that became a story that was able to, you could tell the donors too and say, you know why I like working at the hospital? Let me tell you about some of my colleagues. And then you could tell some of these winter coat stories. And oh, that isn't a mess up though.
Okay,
oh my goodness.
But what you just said made me think of, let's say you have an organization that has a certain program that they're implementing. It's a new program. People have gotten very excited about the program, and you start implementing the program. Okay, well, what you realize is there was something that you needed in addition to what you had already planned out. I mean, how many times do you do that? You with the best of intentions, off on one path, and you realize along the way, oh my gosh, I'm not fully prepared. So maybe you're helping these people, but they didn't have the coats, but you hadn't had the foresight to think, oh my gosh, we should have had coats on hand. So that's a mess-up story that would help drive donations to your organization.
Well, here's another one, and this is a really good question. I'm glad it was asked. There was one group that was trying to find a cure for a medical disease, or I can't even remember the right terminology for this, and I apologize. But what they were trying to do is fund clinical research, and they thought they had a mess-up story, a total failure, because they had funded a project that was just a bust. It didn't go anywhere. It proved totally ineffective, and the guy called me just demoralized. He said, Mark, how do I go back to people and ask them for money? And I was able to say, this is why you exist. There was a list of a possible 100 treatments. You've just tested the first one, and you can cross it off the list and focus on the 99 promising possible treatments. That's why you exist. This isn't a mess up and a failure sort of way. This is a thank you so much, donors. We did it. We finally moved on this one, found another one that didn't work, and it's that whole Thomas Edison. I didn't fail 10,000 times with the light bulb. I found 9,999 ways that a light bulb didn't work. So there's part of it is, I guess it helps to have an optimistic gene. How could I turn this optimistically? But that really helped him and realized, oh, I can actually showcase that in my newsletter. I said I would. That's what this is all about. Clinical studies, excellent trials, verifiable results. You got it all right there.
Okay, so another question is, when you were talking about starting in the middle of a story, what do you mean by that?
Okay, great, good story, good question. I'm thinking, I'll just think of a human interest story, and I'll think of it as a fundraising letter, where if you're telling the story about somebody that's in a tight situation or had something bad happen to them, you don't want to go all the way back to they were born at a young age, their parents' name was mom and dad, and you don't need to do that. You need to, let's say it was a car crash. That was the turning point in this person's story that got them to your nonprofit. You don't have to tell their whole backstory. You start with the car crash. That's in the middle of their life story, but that's the right place to start. And then you can maybe filter in as interest or space allows some of their backstory. Another example is, this may be a loose correlation, but one of the things that Katja Andreessen writes about in her book, Robin Hood Marketing, is that most of us in nonprofits have this really bad habit of wanting people to totally get everything we do. We want them to be totally converted and bought into the cause that we're doing, when really all we need to do is get them to take some discrete action. We need to get them to put a credit card number into a web form. We need to get them to vote on an initiative. We need to get them to send a letter to the editor, something discrete. And so starting in the middle would be, instead of kind of fighting the urge to say, no, you can't give me that donation yet until you fully understand everything that we're doing and why we're doing it and why this is so important to the world. And just starting with, here's the action I'd like you to take next, and trusting that as they get more and more involved in their actions, that they'll learn more and more about the story, about the reasons.
So, so we have a minute here. So we have one other question here about, but what about the opportunity to create that success or happy ending for others?
Absolutely. So that's a good question. I've struggled with this. With Jeff's book, I was trying to work with a library client that was trying to craft their own letters and moving them away from the op-ed sort of libraries are so important. They're still important today, even though people don't say they are. So this is really good. What she had written to me first. It's so hard to write a letter. So congratulations for writing anything. But this is really good for the newspaper. This is an opinion piece. Let's talk about a story of a person. And then I had just read this with Jeff Brooks' new book. And so I said, don't finish the story. Kids in there researching work, trying to find a job because of the bad home situation, but this is a safe space for them. Will you help them in their search? Something like that. And I'm still not, I haven't come to grips with it. Jeff's a lot smarter in fundraising direct mail than me. I do agree with that approach of, we were there for little Susie, but she's not the only one in our community that's suffering this way. Would you be there for the next little Susie? And that, I think, you test it. All this stuff is just, stuff you have to keep testing, but I think that's a smart way to say, because of your support or past support, Susie was taken care of. We want to make sure that we're here for her sister or her neighbor. Would you help us? You're the ones that can do that.
And, I totally agree. I mean, you can say the happy story. Well, let me back up for just a moment. A story answers a question. So you set up the question of what happened to little Susie, and then you answer that question, and your support helped little Susie. And then you can put out, her sister or somebody else. But look at television shows that are really successful, or novels that are really successful. You go from one chapter to another, and typically at the end of a chapter, there will be a sentence or two that sets up the question that you need answered. So you have to continue reading the next chapter. And that's how you get from one chapter to another chapter all the way through a book. They just bring you in. So you can answer the question of what happened to little Susie and how she was helped by the donor, but you also have to put another question in the mind of, well, what about Tommy? So let's help Tommy.
That's powerful. So when we were just watching Partners in Crime, Agatha Christie 2015, Tommy and Tuppence series that came out, and the end of each episode was really well done for the 6 because it did have, I thought it was just a cliffhanger, but I'd never seen the cliffhanger as the setup for they've forced me to ask a question. What happens next? And so we just binge watched them because we wanted to see what happened next. Even though they weren't our most compelling versions of Tommy and Tuppence, it was still like, how are they going to get out of that? That's really good.
Okay, so
that's why you're so smart, Chris.
I could talk about this all day long. Okay, so speaking
we have
talking about it all day long, we could talk about it for 2 whole days.
Whole days.
We have some wickedly smart and entertaining and fun people.
And then there's us too.
And then there's us too, right? So Mark will be there at the storytelling conference. I will be there. Shannon, Harvey McKinnon, who I just interviewed for Movie Mondays over the weekend, and oh my gosh, I cannot wait to introduce you to Harvey. He is a plethora of knowledge about monthly giving and the stories that you need to tell to keep people on the monthly giving, which, oh my gosh, the statistics and the storytelling around that. You have to come and hear Harvey, as well as Jeff Brooks and Tom and Peter. I mean, it's just great. But I want people to know right now that the early bird goes away on Friday. So if you want to save $500 and come to the storytelling conference, which looks like it will end up being sold out this year as well, you got to buy your ticket by Friday. So I want to thank you, Mark, for being here today. I want to thank you all for listening in. It's been great. I've even learned some stuff from you, Mark, which is fabulous. Thank you.
Shoo! I was thinking, here I am. Chris is listening the whole time, and he's the master storyteller. Oh no! Well, I felt like I was being graded. So good. I'm glad.
And also, this recording or this webinar has been recorded, and so I will make it available and send out a link to everybody tomorrow. As well as a link to the slides. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark, and have a great day.
You're welcome.